And now, as we begin, let me invite us to offer a prayer for study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So welcome back, everyone. Today we begin Pirkei Avot chapter 3. As I noted last week, the loose chronology of Pirkei Avot kind of abruptly ends after we are introduced to the 5 disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the first of the great Mishnaic rabbis. So his disciples, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, each is given a place to express a few master teachings. Sorry, my landline phone is ringing. I think that I don't need to answer that. And then after that, we kind of lose the chronology, and most people who have studied Pirkei Avot have not been able to come up with a defining statement about the intended architecture of the rest of the book. So it seems to be a very loosely assembled anthology from here on out. So for the last part of chapter 2, and then for all of chapters 3, 4, and 5, there are going to be moments or extended passages of thematic unity, but it seems as if the ability or desire to collect the statements of the rabbis of the early generations of rabbinic teachers in some kind of discernible order has been lost, at least to us modern readers. So I just wanted to set that up. I still think that we will very much enjoy the reading. And I will endeavor to present just a sentence or two when I am able about the rabbi to whom the teaching in any given instance is ascribed. So without further delay, let's go right in today. I'm going to bring up on the screen the start of our text here. Hang on for a second. Some seems to have strayed from my browser display. Okay, here we go. So as you see on the screen, we have Pirkei Avot chapter 3. That's the 3 at the top. And if you read too fast, you might think that the rabbi's name is Akiva, at least if you're reading in the Hebrew, but it's not. The Yud and the Bet are transposed, so it's a different figure entirely. This is not Akiva, who will come up, who has come up, and who will come up again in Pirkei Avot. This is Akavia. So Akavia, from the same root, by the way, it's an Aramaic derivative of Yaakov. So Akiva is Aramaic for Yaakov or Jacob. Akiva, from the same root, Ayin Kuf Bet, is also related to Akavia. It comes from a word that means the heel or to follow, to come on the heels of something. That's why Yaakov, who is the younger twin of Jacob and Esau in the womb of Rebekah, their mother, grasping Esau's heel as if to attempt even in utero to overtake his firstborn brother who was destined for inheritance. If you know the story of Jacob and Esau, then you know that the name Yaakov is not just any old name, but rather a kind of determinant of character and indicator of storyline. Later, of course, Yaakov will become Yisrael. So this is a person with a similar name, but in the vernacular of its time. Akavia lived at the time of Hillel, so 1st century BCE. Akavia ben Mehalalel, that's his dad, Omer, says, Histakel bishlosha devarim, take a good look. Histakel is a word for look or gaze. Look very closely. Later on in Pirkei Avot, I can't give you chapter and verse, we will see a phrase that uses this verb in one of the more famous sayings of the rabbis, Al tistakel bakankan ele b'masha yeshbo. So al tistakel means do not look at or do not stare or gaze at the kankan. A kankan is a bottle. Do not look at the bottle, ela b'masha yeshbo, but rather what is in it. In other words, it's the early Pirkei Avot version of don't judge a book by its cover. Anyway, that's just a point of clarification on this unusual word that means to look, but to look very deeply, as under a microscope. Histakel bishlosha devarim. Shlosha devarim is, of course, three things. Look well at three things. Ve'iatava lidei avera. And you will not come into literally the clutches of sin. Lidei avera, from yad, from the hand, the grasp, the hands of sin. So mark well these three things, and you will not go astray. And what are those three things? They are these. Da, know, K-N-O-W, me'ayin bata, know me'ayin bata, so know where you came from, know from where you come, ula'an ata holech, and know where you are going, from lech, like lech lecha, holech is the word for to go, also the root of the Hebrew word halacha, which means the way, and refers simply to Jewish law collectively. So know where you come from, know where you're going. V'lifnei mi ata atid liten din v'cheshbon. And know before whom in the future you will have to give a account and reckoning. Cheshbon is a word that you may have heard in a high holiday context before. We talk about the spiritual work of the high holidays being cheshbon hanefesh, literally an accounting of one's soul. So know where you come from, know where you're going, and know before whom in the future, which is often a code word in rabbinic parlance for what happens after you die. Know that in the future, know before whom in the future you will be required to give an account and a reckoning. And we could have stopped there. We could have stopped the text with just those three statements. If you always remember or look closely or mark well, as they translate here, the following three things, you will not sin. We'll talk about why in a minute, of course. That's where the fun part of today's conversation will happen. Know where you come from, know where you're going, and know before whom you must give an account and a reckoning when you die. Yes, and I also got a comment from an astute member of the class in the private chat that Bishlosha Devarim should be familiar to anyone. It is part of the High Holiday liturgy, and probably at some point or another, this text is included in like the little thought bubbles that our Reform Machzor, our Reform Movement High Holiday prayer book provides for contemplation while you're drifting in your thoughts away from what is actually happening on the bima, which is totally fine during the course of the High Holidays. We want your thoughts to go where they will. But in the thoughtful compilations of kind of Jewish food for thought nuggets scattered throughout the High Holiday prayer book, I'm sure that this one has made the cut. Bishlosha Devarim also, Shlosha Devarim is a familiar phrase from rabbinic language because it means three things. And as we've said many times, most of the sayings of Pirkei Avot are structured as three-point mnemonics, a very simple homiletical technique or a simple technique of classical rhetoric to convey a point both concisely and in a way that lends itself well for memorization. So know the following three things and you will not sin: where you came from, where you're going, and before whom you must make an account and a reckoning. And then Akavia, the rabbi who is offering the statement, clarifies his meaning. So back to the Hebrew, says, Me'ayin bata, just if you see where my arrow is flashing, Me'ayin bata, where you came from. In other words, I'm now going to clarify where you came from. And this isn't, I came from, Pennsylvania. That's not the point. Everyone came from the same place, which is mi tipa surucha. Great phrase. You come from a putrid little drop. We'll talk about what that is. But everyone comes from the same thing. They're saying you come from a tipa surucha, a putrid drop. Ula'ana taholech, and where are you going? And again, this is not different. This is the same for every person. Limekom afar rima v'tolea. You are going to a place of dust, worm, and maggot. Happy thoughts, everyone. Good morning. Hope you had your breakfast. And then finally, the lifnei mi ata atid litain din v'cheshbon, and where or who is the one before whom you must in the future give account and reckoning. Lifnei, it is before the melech malchei hamlachim. That's a phrase anyone who's davened aleinu knows. The king of kings, the supreme sovereign, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of blessing, exactly the way it appears in the Aleinu prayer. Let's unpack this a little bit. I think we've now had it up on the screen long enough to absorb. So if I take the screen share off, we'll be able to see one another's faces. And I kind of invite your comments on what's the deeper meaning here? What is this business about putrid drops and dust worms and maggots and the King of Kings? And what do each of these components have to do with keeping a person far from sin? I've learned to get very comfortable with pregnant pauses, by the way. I feel bad for the people on YouTube who are going to be like checking their computers to see, is this working? Did the feed freeze? So you're not a bashful group. Right. Okay. So somebody points out, Stephen, thank you. This is evocative of the passage we looked at just last week that says, repent one day before you die, or make teshuvah one day before you die. So the awareness of mortality, that's the second of the three pieces, by the way. If we really want to get closely analytical here, we have three components. So one way we keep ourselves from going astray in life and in Judaism is by a constant attention to our own mortality. And the awareness that, oh no, I am going to die, is exactly a prompt to a life of righteous conduct that will earn a person reward, possibly of some sort, in the world as it is, and also in the hereafter, as the rabbis express it. And again, I'm not saying that this is so highly dogmatic that this is a belief that every Jewish person has always or nowadays accepts. I'm simply saying that in the classical Mishnaic framework, it is, I think, taken as a given by the rabbis that there is an olam haba, a next phase of your existence after you die, and that your conduct here on earth matters, and therefore one should constantly keep in mind one's own mortality as a goad to righteousness while living. Other comments either in the chat window or you'd like to unmute yourself. Michelle Braun says, we are nothing, we are but dust. Remember that people, or at least individuals, are insignificant, but also not insignificant because we are responsible for our own actions. Exactly. So very nice. There's a lot here. You know, there's a link that's established without actually using the word between humility and freedom or liberation from our own sinfulness, or from the temptation to sin, more accurately, I think, because it's not really so much about your character or your innate attributes. It's about your behavior. It's about your actions, which are not the same thing. Judaism affirms that actions are what speak loudest and attest to a person's character, and that none of us need be despondent that our Yetzer Hara, another word that we unpacked 2 weeks ago, I believe, should keep us in its grip, the evil inclination, inescapably. In other words, we're always wrestling with the impulse to do good and the impulse to do bad, and that the choice is ours, and that the human being is given the free will and the ability, the empowerment by the divine creator to choose a life of righteous action. And so that, I think, is the framework. And but it's always a choice, right? And it's never an easy thing to do. So I think the rabbis acknowledge that on the one hand, a human being is capable of nobility and majesty and even approximate divinity. And if you look at I think the most eloquent testimony to this effect is Psalms chapter 8, which says, what are we, O God? And it goes on to say, you have made us like unto the angels, and yet little more than the beasts. I'm paraphrasing. Somebody who has a Tanakh nearby might want to look it up. It's really eloquently expressed that we are, on the one hand, animal creatures of a beastly nature, and on the other hand, we are part divine, imbued with characteristics that are unique to humanity, whether you want to consider that a soul, or I would not equate it with a soul, because I've met lots of animals with souls, but maybe moral agency is something that human beings uniquely possess. And therefore the rabbi, or the biblical poet of the Psalms ascribes that part of our humanity to a divine nature. So on the one hand, yes, we are capable of nobility, majesty, and even what I just called approximate divinity. And on the other hand, we are constantly in a bodily shell that by its nature begins with a putrid drop. So that is probably semen or ejaculate. I think the rabbis are being very literal here. And we are going to a place that is equally icky. So they identify death with the physical manifestation of what happens when we die, that you turn to dust and the worms and the maggots eat your flesh. It's a really vivid, really discomforting image, and I would say intentionally. Judy, do you want to chime in here now?
First of all, when you were talking about who we are in the phrase B'Tselem Elohim, that we are
beautiful. I didn't use that phrase, and I'm glad you did. We are made in the image of God. Go on.
The image of God, and also in this Pirkei Avot translation, which is not the one that you have, I think, in front of you. There are two things. There's a capitalization and a lowercase, and I wonder if it's meant to be. It says here, where are you going, and before whom you will give justification. That whom is lowercase w. And then the next one is, then before whom you will give justification is in a capital I. So is it the lowercase to humanity and the uppercase to justify before God?
I have a different conjecture, but of course, not knowing or being the translator, I can never know exactly what the translator had in mind here. But there's an art to translation, and I think that if you're reading the text for the first time, the question is an open one. Oh, before whom do I have to give a reckoning? I think we all know that, of course, because this is religious literature, and the very suggestion that after you die you're going to have to give a reckoning. Well, who else would it be, right? It's not going to be Tommy Lasorda. So you have to come up with a reasonable conjecture, but it's almost as if by using a lowercase w for whom, the translator is kind of burying the lead, doesn't want to give away that, of course, the answer is God. Because anytime you capitalize a pronoun, it's almost, unless it's the start of a sentence, it's a reference to God, at least in Jewish religious literature. So he's and whom's, when they take a capital, it's a giveaway that the antecedent is God. But here there is no antecedent. It's a question. It's a, whatever the opposite of an antecedent is, I guess a postcedent. It refers to something that will be revealed at the end of the text. Lifnei hamelech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu, the King of Kings, the Supreme Ruler, the Holy One of Blessing. And then the capital W is your tip-off. So I'm viewing it more as the translator wanted the question to lead the reader to have a more open idea until the very end when the reveal comes. But so I think that it's consistent. In other words, I don't think that there's no way that the translator or that the text is alluding to anyone other than God as the one before whom a mortal being offers a reckoning at the end of life. Okay, Dad, you've got a hand up, please.
Excuse me. It seems to me there are two ways a passage that starts like this could go. If you start with, you come from muck and you're going to muck, there are two conclusions you could possibly draw about your life. One would be, in that case, it just doesn't matter what I do because it's all corruption. And the opposite of that is that it is very consequential what you do. So I'm wondering if this is just another restatement of an anti-Hellenistic point of view versus a rabbinic point of view.
Lovely. I think that that's a wonderful conjecture. Of course, there's no way definitively of answering it, but it reminds us what we took up at some length last week and in previous sessions, that the context matters, milieu matters. And, you know, I've often said that if I ever did go back to pursue a PhD, the field of study, esoteric though it may sound, to me, I think it's monumentally consequential for our understanding of how Judaism functions, is the field of academic study called history of interpretation, which basically suggests that texts take on meanings that cannot be dissociated from the context in which they are, one, written, and two, read. And that the meaning of a text is a byproduct or a cross product of not only what the author had in mind for the original intended audience, but also for how later audiences and readers have understood and applied that text. It's a fascinating field. It was really pioneered by the great Jewish scholar Michael Fishbane, who teaches Jewish theology and history of interpretation at the University of Chicago graduate program, and was a leading exponent of this field. It was my professor, Rabbi Dr. David Aaron, who's professor of Hebrew Bible and history of interpretation at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. So I really was inspired by what I learned from Dr. Aaron, which is that, yes, okay, so when you want to understand what was in mind at the time this text was composed, compiled, and presented to its audience, there's a lot to recommend the interpretation of this text and others like it, and especially Pirkei Avot, as a polemic against Hellenism and the Hellenistic view of what matters in life. One such, this was too reductionist here, but one such exponent we explored last week was Epicurus, the Greek philosopher. And I'm grateful to our congregant, Rosalind Black, who joins our class most weeks and who followed up with me. And she's here today. Hi, Rosalind. She followed up with me with a further note, a quote attributed to Epicurus, the Epicurean view being that the whole point of life is to pursue what pleasure life can offer you while you can. And I think that that is one, not the only, but one expression of a Hellenistic outlook against which a text like this polemicizes. Then, you know, history of interpretation would then say, okay, well, what does it mean to us today? Or what did it mean for rabbis living in diaspora in the 14th century? Those are equally fascinating questions, but I think that if you want to really get at what was in mind with Akavia ben Mahalalel, the speaker here, an anti-Hellenistic view of the world is a well-taken contribution to our understanding of the text. Nice. Anyone else on this text? So I want to share with you a little midrash that actually is offered in the commentary on this text. This is attributed to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, so he's another one of the Mishnaic sages. And this statement is redacted in a collection of early statements of the rabbis, not Pirkei Avot, but a kind of companion volume called Avot de Rabbi Natan. So it's also, and it's really interesting, Avot de Rabbi Natan does not mean the fathers of Rabbi Nathan. It may mean that. But Avot is also a word that means master teachings or chapters. So Pirkei Avot could just mean the chapters of the master teachings and not just the master teachers. The fathers with a lowercase f in the sense of not people, but the wisdom that has inspired generations. So Avot de Rabbi Natan is this other volume of early rabbinic teachings. And this text is quoted, the text of Akavia ben Mahalalel about you come from muck. I like that. You're going to muck, but you still stand before God when it's all over. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar teaches the following parable. He says, to what may this be likened? In other words, the way in which the existence of a mortal being, a human being, is analogized here. To what may this be likened? This is like, he says, a king who built a large palace and then decorated it. But a tannery pipe led through the palace and emptied at the doorway of the palace. So anyone has ever visited a tannery, I have not, knows that, shall we say, tanneries tend to be aromatic because of what's happening there. So they smell very foul, and the waste that is produced at tanneries is conveyed out from the factory through a pipe, and it dumps all this muck at the doorway of a great and opulently decorated palace. That's the setup here. And Elazar goes on to say, every passerby would say, how handsome and magnificent this palace would be if it were not for the tannery pipe coming through it. So too is a man, or a human being. If then, with a foul stream issuing from his bowels, a person can exalt himself over all other creatures, how much the more so would one exalt oneself over other creatures if a stream of, say, precious oil or fragrant balsam or ointment issued from him? So in other words, wouldn't it be even better if instead of poop and pee, human beings issued forth fragrant oil or perfume, right? Or I think that, to get really crass, one of my favorite expressions is when a person is perhaps so much in the good graces of others that flaws cannot be detected, we might say that that person shits rainbows. So, right. So wouldn't it be nice if people just shat rainbows? Okay. We know we don't. We are people. We digest food. We emit noxious odors. That is part of what it means to be a human being. And then the second part, also in the Avot de Rabbi Natan parable. And where are you going? To a place of dust, of worm, and of maggot. Remembering that the end of all human beings is the same, and that in the end we all go to our graves, this will keep a person humble and not focused on seeking material gain. So that's the gloss that is provided. So I think it further corroborates the perspective that some of us have already shared this morning. Okay, so let's proceed after all of this foul stuff. I'm going to bring back onto the screen our text, and we're now going to look at chapter 2. And you can see that, I think loosely these ideas connect, but again, emphasis on loosely. Now, the text we're going to look at is ascribed to one Rabbi Hanina, who was the vice high priest. So in other words, he is a Kohen. There's no contradiction here. It is possible for a rabbi to be a Kohen or a Levi or a Yisrael or a plain old Jew. The fact of priestly lineage in the rabbinic period also came with some ceremonial function, even though the priesthood had been largely stripped of its official capacity as the administrators of the sacrificial cult, which of course ceased to be definitively upon the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. But Rabbi Hanina actually lived through the destruction of the Second Temple. So he's very early in the chronology of sages. And therefore, it is possible to imagine that at some point in his tenure or his life, he actually served real priestly functions, and at a very high level. As vice high priest, he would have filled in for the Kohen Gadol if the Kohen Gadol, for whatever reason, were incapacitated or ritually defiled and couldn't serve for a time. Maybe there's some connection between the statement we're about to read, ascribed to Rabbi Hanina, and the great political unrest that he witnessed during his lifetime. So let's start with Rabbi Hanina. There's a second part of this Mishna, this teaching, ascribed to a different rabbi. But let's start with this one. Okay, I have to still bring it up on the screen after my preamble. So Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, you can see Rabbi Hanina Sagan HaKohanim Omer. And by the way, the word Sagan is the same as the last name Sagan, like Carl Sagan. It is a priestly name. And often people with the name Sagan or Sagan are actually Kohanim or Leviim. So sometimes Sagans or sometimes Kagan also is a derivative of Cohen. So Sagan and Kagan and Sagan and Saganowitz, there are all sorts of Jewish names that derive from these biblical or these rabbinic terms. Rabbi Hanina Sagan HaKohanim Omer, Heve mitpalel bishlomach shel malchut. Pray for the welfare of the government. For were it not for the fear that it, meaning the government, inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive. All right, so let's start there. Pray for the welfare of the government. And clearly they're not only talking about whatever Jewish religious officials. In fact, I think quite the opposite. This is specifically and explicitly about the secular government, even a tyrannical government, by the way. It doesn't distinguish what kind of government. Is it a good government? Is it a bad government? If you have the misfortune of being a Jew in Baghdad in 1941, as were tens of thousands of our people, you learned, if you were at our Tikkun Leil Shavuot this past Sunday, something fascinating. I attended a study session on Sunday night with Rabbi Levi, whose father is a Jew from Baghdad, who emigrated to Israel in 1957. He was born in 1947. So he was born after the event that I'm about to describe to you took place. But on Shavuot in 1941, a massive pogrom known as the Farhud was carried out by Baghdadi police and military officials against the Jews of Baghdad. And it prompted many Jews to get out of Baghdad. Of course, you know, as has happened throughout Jewish history, when there's a pogrom, some take it as their signal that things are not going to get better. We better get out of here or we might lose our lives or our livelihoods. Others stay behind in the hopes that things might turn around, and usually they do not. So most Jews did not leave Baghdad at the time. Anyway, if you have the misfortune of being a Jew in Baghdad in 1940s, you are no less invited by this Pirkei Avot teaching to offer a prayer for the government than, say, living in America in 2021. And I wanted to bring on screen a couple of examples of what I'm talking about just before we open this up for dialogue. So I found a few prayers for the government. This is one of the areas, in which liturgical creativity has been encouraged for centuries. So interestingly, there are many different formulae or versions of the Jewish prayer for the government. This one was written by the great rabbi and scholar and compiler of Midrash, Louis Ginsburg. Dr. Ginsburg wrote a 7-volume set that some of you may have on your bookshelves. I know I do at the office, called Legends of the Jews. And it's basically like a very rich, very deep, very complete collection of all the different Midrashic traditions on the story that's told in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. So Ginsburg, though, had a lot of different and far-ranging interests, and this is his version of a Jewish prayer for the government. So I'll bring it on screen. And could I ask a reader to read this for us in English, please? This is not hard. It's just really nice. Somebody who would like to read, just unmute yourself and begin, please. All right, I'm going to call on Alan Markowitz because he's at the top of my screen, even though he didn't have a hand.
Our God and God of our ancestors, accept with mercy our prayer for our land and its government. Pour out your blessing on this land and on its president, judges, officers, and officials who work faithfully for the public good. Teach them from the laws of your Torah, enlighten them with the rules of your justice, so that peace, tranquility, happiness, and freedom will never depart from our land. God of all that lives, please bestow your spirit on all the inhabitants of our land and plant love, fellowship, peace, and friendship between the different communities and faiths that dwell here. Uproot from their hearts all hate, animosity, jealousy, and strife, in order to fulfill the longings of its people who aspire for its dignity and desire to see it as a light for all nations. And so may it be God's will that our land be a blessing for all who live on earth, and that fellowship and liberty will dwell between them. Establish soon the vision of your prophet. Nation will not raise a sword against nation, and they will no longer learn war. And as it is said, for all of them will know me, from the smallest to the greatest. Amen.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alan. It's a lovely prayer for the government. He composed it in Hebrew and did not do his own translation. So the prayer he actually wrote was in Hebrew, and the translation was provided recently by Rabbi Tim Bernard. This is found on opensidor.org. This website right here that I've highlighted at the top of your screen on the top left. Opensidor.org is a crowdsourced prayer book online. It's not the most accurate, but it's really nice because it incorporates lots of different viewpoints and translations. So I thought that you would enjoy seeing that. I'm going to share one other one on screen, and then we'll have a chance to chat about all of this. These prayers for the government and what they're all about and what function they serve and how they are composed. So this is the one that is actually in our Mishkan Tefillah, our Reform Movement prayer book that was published in 2007. There's also a beautiful prayer for our country that you probably are familiar with from the High Holiday prayer book, because we actually do include it in our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur morning liturgy. Just before we put the Torah away, we hold the Torah in front of the congregation and we offer a prayer for the country. So these prayers for country and for government of said country are part of a very time-honored Jewish tradition. Let's get a different reader here, maybe somebody of the female persuasion. Samantha Koss, how do you feel about reading for us?
Happy to.
Great. Start from the top. It's a two-part prayer.
Sure. Thus says Adonai, this is what I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of lawlessness, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry and take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, give clothing and do not ignore your own kin. If you banish the yoke from your midst, the menacing hand, the evil speech, if you offer compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then your light shall shine in the darkness.
All from Isaiah chapter 58. If it is familiar to you, it should be, because it's the Haftarah portion, the prophetic reading for the morning of Yom Kippur. So it's the culminating passage of this gorgeous prophetic polemic against religious hypocrisy and neglect of the needy. It's the passage, though, it's just before, or it's actually, they cut the word out, but in the first line, this is what I desire, the actual line is, this is the fast that I desire. So you might recall that the reason it's read on Yom Kippur is right before this passage, Isaiah proclaims, is this the fast I desire, bowing your head like a reed and, covering yourself in sackcloth and ashes, and all of these kind of pietistic demonstrations of self-abnegation and flagellation. And then God says, no, what I really desire, the fast that I desire, what the kind of conduct from which I want you to refrain is not eating and drinking. I want you to refrain from wickedness, as articulated in the following line. So it starts with this preamble from Isaiah, which is fascinating because it doesn't start with leaders and officials. Samantha, if you don't mind continuing with
Sure.
the second paragraph, please.
O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of this earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they help govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. Amen.
Beautiful. So just a few, I think, really lovely examples of prayers for the government. These are more modern ones. You'll find more ancient ones as well. And the kind of government, and again, here's a great example of where milieu really matters. You can learn a lot about the kind of government and the kind of political and social milieu in which these prayers may have been composed simply from the prayers themselves. You can infer a lot from what the prayers themselves imply about the rulership, and in kind of more tyrannical or repressive regimes, Jewish prayers for the government have been much more direct appeals and petitions for the governing authorities to govern with compassion and fairness, as opposed to the last one we looked at, which was much more, I would say, kind of populist or grassroots or civic minded about the responsibilities of the citizenry, and only with a kind of modest little appeal to the officials. Thoughts on Rabbi Hanina's comments here about pray for the welfare of the government. And remember that what he said as the follow-up is pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear that the government inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive. I'm going to check the comment that I received in the chat window. Yeah, nothing of note here.
Okay. Iman, you want to say something?
Well, I'm sorry. I mean,
We can hear you.
Yeah, pardon?
Yes, okay.
There is
Go
a
for it.
connection here to a reality that I sense that there was really a purpose, particularly in the last few words that you read, because it is almost instinctively true that what separates us from the animals is anything that is beyond the eat. Is it the, still the hunger, eating, multiplying, but not thinking? And this is, to me, a wonderful example of what really separates humanity, capital H, from the animal kingdom, capital A and K. And it must reach very, very far back in the process of evolution, that there was an awareness that there has to be something beyond the satisfaction of the meanest or the lowest desires that we all share in a Judaic form.
I love how you've connected the first and second texts here. The idea of the acknowledgement of mankind's most base impulses and desires to the second statement of Rabbi Hanina, and that, look, there are lots of ways in which human beings rise above our base impulses and appetites. One is through the kind of spiritual contemplation that the first text, Akavia ben Mahalalel, advises, right? Cultivating humility by knowing that you come from muck, you're going to muck, and that God will require an accounting from you. But we also have institutions and the ability to govern ourselves and organize ourselves into functioning societies that also curb base impulses and the desire of human beings, in the very colorful language of the second text ascribed to Hanina, to eat one another alive. I love your ability to find and foster connection between these two texts. So let's just use that and let's run with it, and let's go forward a little bit. We now meet a character whose name is similar to Hanina, and I wonder here if the only meaningful connection is that these two guys have similar names, right? So here, one rabbi is Hanina, and then somebody who is editing this volume says, oh yeah, and we've also got a Hanania. Maybe. That doesn't seem very compelling intellectually, but it works mnemonically. Remember, if the idea is to get young yeshiva bochers to memorize these texts, then it might function well. Okay, so Rabbi Hanina Bentaradion. Now, if that name is familiar, it's because he comes up in a dramatic and upsetting narrative that is recounted on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. He and Akiva and 8 others, the 10 sages of the second generation of the Mishnaic period, are considered to be, or are known as, the 10 martyrs of the early rabbis. They were rounded up by the Romans and flayed with whips and all sorts of other instruments of torture in a public gladiatorial arena and burned alive at the stake in front of a cheering audience at some point around the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, as a kind of public display that would crush and humiliate the spirits of the Jewish people to watch their leaders tormented, tortured, and murdered in front of a crowd. So the 10 martyrs of the tradition are recounted every year on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, as part of a service known in Hebrew as Ele Ezkera, which means "these do I remember." And it's better known in English by its English name, the Martyrology service. So Hanania Bentaradion is a sage who is recounted in the Martyrology service as having been covered in wet cloth and then burned alive. Sorry, not wet cloth, that's Akiva. The legend that's told about Hanania is that he was wrapped in a Torah scroll and then burned alive, which would have been a tremendous blow to the Jewish community, just to witness this horrific sight. To say nothing of the incredible suffering that was brought to Rabbi Hanania Bentaradion. So let's look at what Hanania Bentaradion had to say here. If two sit together and there are no words of Torah spoken between them, then this is a session of scorners. And that language is a quote from the very first line of the Hebrew book of Psalms from the Bible. As it is said, nor sat he in the seat of the scornful, but rather the teaching of the Lord is his delight. So this is a praise for the person who keeps away from bad company and rather sits around studying Torah all day long. That's how the book of Psalms begins, with an ode to the scholar, or to the student of Torah. And it's interesting that a text extolling the virtues of studying Torah spends quite some time quoting scripture. So the text is actually doing what the text says to do. So it's very meta, right? You follow my meaning here? That it's not just saying that one should study Torah all the time. It's actually giving the person who's looking at Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, section 2, the chance to study some Torah by having scriptural quotation used to prove the point that is being offered here. Okay, so if two people sit together but do not speak Torah, this is a session of scorners, and they're just wasting their time. It's just wasted breath. If we have a conversation and it's just, oh, hi, how are you? How are the kids? What did you buy at, the mall today? That's not really the kind of company that one in the Jewish tradition, or at least not a yeshiva bacher, is encouraged to keep. And this is consistent with themes we've seen since chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot, of the life of Torah being the highest and best use of a young man's days. Okay, but it goes on. If two sit together and there are words of Torah spoken between them, then the Shekhinah abides among them, as it is said. Then they that feared the Lord spoke with one another, and the Lord hearkened and heard, and a book of remembrance was written before him. There's capital H him, meaning God, for them that feared the Lord and that thought upon his name. And this is from the prophet Malachi or Malachi. We'll look at that passage in a moment. Now, I have no, and here the bracket goes on to say, scriptural proof for the presence of the Shekhinah, except among two, how do we know that even one who sits and studies Torah, the Holy One, blessed be he, fixes his reward? So in other words, let me unpack the grammar here, or the syntax, which is not very, it's kind of clunks. We start with the idea that when two people are sitting together and they're in I'll take the text off the screen while I explain this. Two people sit together and they don't even bring up a word of Torah. There's nothing holy about their conversation. They are reckoned to be a congregation of scorners, which is language that comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 1, verse 1. But that's only an antilogue or a straw man for what people are being encouraged to do, which is when you sit to have a conversation, you should elevate your conversation by studying Torah. And not only that, whenever two people come to study Torah together, a third party dwells among them and maybe even within them. And that third party is identified in the text as Shekhinah, which is not a word we've seen in Pirkei Avot yet, but which is found throughout the rabbinic literature. It is not, to my knowledge, a term that is found, or at least not used that way, in the Bible. So this is a rabbinic, the rabbis introduced this way of understanding God. And this is specifically a reference to the way in which God is made manifest in human affairs. So the rabbis believe that God is both immanent with an A, not an I. Well, it has an I at the beginning. immanent, as well as transcendent. So what is immanent? Again, with an A. immanent, imminent with an I means something is about to happen soon, right? Rain is imminent. I don't know if that's true. It doesn't look like it, but there you go. Shabbat is imminent in that it happens tomorrow at sundown. Immanent with an A in the middle means near or even indwelling. Something is very, very close, usually in space as opposed to time. So immanent with an I is time, because time has an I in the middle of T-I-M-E, and immanent with an A is space, because space has an A in the middle. That's my mnemonic for remembering the difference between the two. So for the rabbis, God is both immanent with an A and also transcendent, which needs no clarification. Transcendent meaning above or beyond or surpassing. God is both near and far, to really boil it down. But it's more than that, because there's so much that flows from this duality to God. There is the God who can be very close, dwelling within, who is felt, detected at a very, very close level by a human being. And then there's the transcendent God, the God of stars and moons and cosmic, and even quarks. It's not about size, right? The God of the laws of nature, the God that is felt when you go to the Grand Canyon versus the God that is felt when you witness the birth of your child. Okay, that's a really good metaphorical way maybe of getting inside the difference between immanent and transcendent. But of course, God is unique in that God is both immanent and transcendent. So the immanent dimension of God is often assigned the Hebrew word Shekhinah, which comes from the root shin, kaf, nun, shachan or shochein, which means to dwell. And in fact, even today, not in no religious way whatsoever, a neighborhood is a shchuna, shin, kaf, vav, nun, he. Shchuna is a neighborhood. And your neighbors are your shchenim, the people who live near you. So Shekhinah means the near or the immanent aspect of God. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, centuries and centuries and centuries later, I mean, the Zohar, the chief text of Kabbalah, of Jewish mystical inquiry and exploration, is not written until the 13th century, even though it poses as a book from much earlier. So the whole point of Shekhinah is elaborated extensively in the mystical literature. It is to suggest that there is that which people can do very much in the sphere of earthly affairs that can actually summon not God in God's totality, but rather an aspect of God, a manifestation of God, an element, one part of God's infinite essence to be perceived and discernible in the most intimate realm of human interaction. And finally, the only other thing I'll say is that Martin Buber elaborates this aspect of God through his magisterial work, I and Thou, or Ich und Du in German. I and Thou is basically a theology of relationship that suggests that the way in which human beings most actively encounter the divine is through a relationship that is deep, sincere, and where a person is not merely looking at another person for a utilitarian purpose. How can my barista get me the drink I ordered at Starbucks? But rather at the deepest and most real level of human relationship and communication. And when that happens, says Buber, when you have an I-thou lowercase t relationship with another person, an eternal thou, meaning God or the divine, dwells in that relationship and becomes a characteristic of that relationship. There you go. That's Buber on one foot, as well as immanent, transcendent, Jewish mysticism, all from this one phrase. Now, specifically here for the rabbis, the action that summons the Shekhinah, the immanent or the indwelling or the near manifestation of God to the realm of human affairs, is when two people sit and study Torah. The text will go on, and I promise to unpack it, but it goes on to say, oh, and we have a proof text for this, say the rabbis. So Hanina Bentaradion says, not only is this true, I can prove it using a scriptural text. Here's Malachi the prophet, who says something that can be used to prove that when two people study Torah, the Shekhinah is with them. Then the rabbi, Hanina, goes on to conjecture. He says, I don't have scripture that can prove this, but how can we demonstrate that even if one person is doing the Torah study thing, that the Shekhinah also dwells with him? That's where the text will go. We'll unpack that in a minute. I want to acknowledge my dad's hand, and anyone else who'd like to speak at this time, please raise a hand or unmute yourself in whatever sequence makes the most sense. Okay, you're on. You're unmuted.
Maybe you want to put the text up again, but I would be fascinated to see how you want to tie together the first part. Can we drop it down a little bit here?
Yeah, there you go.
For were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive, pray for the welfare of the government. It seems to me that, I don't know whether I can use the word sarcastic here, because I would have to say that in Rabbi's experience, especially since he got, Rabbi Hanania got burned at the stake, that he could not possibly think that the government in his experience would probably have been the one who would try to swallow the neighbor, who would be the oppressor here. So yeah, he's putting up a contrary argument, and it seems to me he's not being very sincere at all about pray for the welfare of the government. It's basically like, right, you know what these SOBs will do to us.
Yeah, especially, by the way, if you study Torah.
Right, you'd be better off studying the Torah with a buddy.
Yeah, I think that that's very well taken. And there might be a kind of, there's a lot that's possibly connecting them. Remember where I started, which is that maybe the only connecting point is that they have similar sounding names. We shouldn't discount that, by the way, because of the mnemonic function and style of this literature. So I just want to say that, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, and in this case, if it looks like it could be a mnemonic, it probably is a mnemonic that you put Hanina and Hanania back to back, helps you memorize their statements, maybe. But there's probably more going on here. Now Hanina, remember, was not necessarily, he wasn't burned at the stake. Hanania was. But Hanina lived through the destruction of the temple. So I think that, your conjecture that Hanina has an unfavorable view of the government, to say the least, and that this might be a sarcastic or ironic statement is certainly a possibility for us. the redactor here, whether that's Judah Hanasi, several generations down the road, or someone else who gets identified with Judah Hanasi, who's the compiler of the Mishna, just to remind you, the late 5th generation sage in the first half of the 3rd century CE, Common Era. Whoever compiled this text might have put Hananiah next to Hanina, specifically knowing that Hananiah was martyred by the Roman government specifically for the act of teaching Torah and studying Torah, right? So that you have Hananiah's teaching about the divinity that inheres when one studies Torah, and it's next to a statement about the risks or the fear that that a tyrannical government might inspire. And you get a code you get like a secret code for the backstory of Rabbi Hanina Bentaradion, who was martyred by the Roman government without actually ever saying it. So what could be happening here is a very clever way that the rabbis are alluding to the martyrdom, the murder of Hanina Bentaradion at the hands of the Roman government without actually ever saying it. Because were they to say it, they could get in trouble. And at best, the literature could have been censored, or worse, the writers of the literature could have been punished as well.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Does that make sense? So you see that there could be some secret code and hidden meaning happening just in the fact that these two texts are juxtaposed. So I really appreciate you bringing attention to it. That's really cool. I've never thought about that before. So what I've just shared with you was an ad lib. But now that you've made it, now that I'm thinking it, I can't unthink it. Let me get to the end of the text, and then there'll be a little bit more time to chat about it. So we have the proof text that when two people dwell together and study words of Torah, or share words of Torah, the Shekhinah abides among them. And here's the text from Malachi. Then they that feared the Lord spoke with one another. So in other words, when you have God-fearing people speaking with one another, that's code for, well, they must have been speaking Torah because they are God-fearers. Then the Lord hearkened and heard. And a book of remembrance was written before God. In other words, God remembered this deed. So God was part of the conversation for them that fear the Lord and that thought upon his name. So God remembered the good deed of those who came into a conversation, two God-fearers. And not only that, but the God-fearing people were the two God-fearing people who were speaking together were specifically invoking God. So it was a religious conversation, and God liked that. Now, the last part. I have no scriptural proof for the presence of the Shekhinah except among two. In other words, I can bring you a scripture, this chapter 3, verse 16 of the prophet Malachi, to prove, as it were, that when two people get together in a God-fearing way and exchange holy words, then God dwells with them or among them as a Shekhinah, as an immanent presence of God. I can't prove it, but how do we know that even one who sits and studies Torah? So even if I, by myself, just take out my Chumash and study, which I do from time to time. I love studying in groups. I love studying in my chavruta. I just met with Rabbi Katsu yesterday afternoon. We get together, we do a lot of schmoozing. We actually ended up studying some Talmud, which we usually get to. That's my favorite way to encounter Torah is in chavruta. But how can we prove that even if you do it by yourself, that the Holy One, blessed be God, fixes his reward? In other words, that God recognizes the act of studying Torah by one's lonesome. As it is said, and he does have a scripture for it. Look at that. He finds something in the book of Lamentations, which is the text that is recited with a lot of sobriety on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the destruction of the temple commemoration observance. As it is said, though he sits alone and meditates in stillness, yet he takes reward unto himself. Now, we can look at both of these verses, so I'll call them up, but I'm wondering, does anyone have a comment, thought, or question? Audrey writes a great one in the chat box that I'll take up. Isn't the Shekhinah usually thought of as the feminine aspect of God? Quite correct. Yeah, and this is really through Kabbalah, through Jewish mysticism, that God's totality, say the Kabbalists, cannot be conveyed through a single all-encompassing essence, at least not in a way that human beings with all of our mental limitations could possibly comprehend. So the only way, say the Kabbalists, that a human being can understand God is, as it were, in bite-sized bits, or through manifestations of God or aspects of God that individually can be better comprehended by a limited, frail, mortal human being. You with me on this? Not only that, certain aspects of God are ascribed characteristics that human beings can relate to. So in that interest, the Shekhinah is often described as the feminine aspect of God, and Malchut, another way of understanding God through the Kabbalistic frame, is ascribed or described as the masculine aspect of God. And by the way, it's not coincidental that the union of the aspects of God, both masculine and feminine, is depicted in explicitly sexual language, and that the generative power of the divine is in part made possible through the unification of God's masculine and feminine attributes, which creates a divine flow into the world. So in other words, what energizes the divine not to be restricted as, say, an old man in the sky or a deity that is not involved in the creation? How do we account for the fact of the divinity or of God's presence not only being transcendent but also immanent? What causes divinity to connect from transcendent to immanent, from the realm of the cosmos and that which is beyond human understanding to that which can be felt and understood at a very intimate level by God? It is that unification of masculine and feminine. Thank God I've been studying Kabbalah for the last 2 years, because I would never have been able to explain this stuff. And it probably still doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, because even as I'm saying it, I'm like, wow, I kind of lack the language to put this together, which is why so much study of Kabbalah requires diagrams. You've probably seen them, like this little map of different circles with Hebrew letters in them in this little kind of like trapezoidal chart. It's cuckoo. But it's cool. It's really cool once you really get into it. The way in which the Kabbalists, all it is look, all I want to say is that it's not, I won't tell you what it isn't. I'll tell you what it is. It's metaphorical vocabulary for understanding how God functions both in and outside the world of human experience. It's another set of vocabulary to help people, Jews, make sense of how God functions in the world. And it's for me, it's been tremendously spirit opening. I was going to say eye opening, but that's not really what I mean. It has been tremendously liberating to begin to learn and explore a new set of vocabularies to describe, define, and concretize how the human being encounters the divine. Because I think any one way of approaching that question is by its nature limited. So, you know, even the God of the Hebrew Bible is not a uniform character. The God of Genesis is very different from the God of Deuteronomy. And the God of Deuteronomy is very different, as we said last week, from the God of Job. So I don't want to present that I hate the idea of an Old Testament God, because I'm going to say, well, which book of the Old Testament? And sometimes even within a book, particularly the early books of the Torah. I mean, the God of the Exodus experience is vastly different from the God who commands the Israelites, now build me a tabernacle so that I can meet you in the wilderness. The God of liberating the Jews with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand with signs and wonders is very different from the God who appears to the Israelites as cloud and fire, both in image and in function. So I don't want to make it sound like there's just a biblical God, and then there's a rabbinic God, and then you have the Kabbalist God, and you have the God of Maimonides, because even any one of these is so multifaceted and in many times self-contradictory, that I can't even make one sensible statement that coheres and tries to convey the totality of what Jewish people mean when they talk about God. Well, that was fun. Judy, comment?
I love what you just said, and it really highlights and it just so much of what we read in the Torah. The other thing it highlights is the universality of the oneness. We study Hindu scripture with our son-in-law. This is what we're studying, the various aspects of Brahman, and it's all there. And it's so there's such it's important philosophically. It's not that easy. You have to really boil it down to understand it with my mind, but it makes me think so beyond it's so beyond the mundane. It's so uplifting. And
Thank
what
you.
you're saying, it's fascinating. You're so right about the God is so, our God is so different. That person, that persona, that spirit.
Right. And I would say, by the way, I love the fact that you can share what you have learned from and with your Hindu son-in-law. And you know, many of us have a kind of very surfacey understanding of Eastern spirituality, Hinduism in particular, and are a little bit squeamish around it because the kind of the reputation that Hinduism gets is that it's a highly polytheistic way of looking at the world, and there are so many gods, and that Judaism has a kind of better system in that we are monotheistic. But that is so inaccurate, and B, reductionist.
All those gods are manifestations of
Exactly.
the one, and that's what you've just explained.
Exactly. So for me, as I have studied, you know, on the one hand, I've been studying Kabbalah and Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism. So Hasidism is an Central Eastern European movement, starts in the 18th century, but it is chiefly indebted to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Lots of things are. So is the theology of Isaac Luria. If you ever been to Tzfat, that's Isaac Luria's place. All the blue doors and all the cool, kooky, mystical stuff that happens in the northern part of Israel on that mountaintop city. That's another strain of Jewish mysticism. But Hasidism is Jewish mysticism. And the Hasidic writers are often much more approachable than the Zohar itself, the original Kabbalistic text. And then on the other hand, I've been practicing meditation that is rooted in the Vedic tradition. The Vedas are 4 master texts that inform Hindu spirituality. So they're kind of the original Indian tradition, very ancient texts, and many of them ruminate on the meaning or the manifestations of the gods, but you realize that they're really speaking in very similar languages, that, you know, these different quote unquote gods were just ways of understanding an infinite divine presence that human beings in our limitations, mental, emotional, and spiritual, cannot comprehend in their totality. So you got to break it down, right? All right. So as we looked at this, I called up on my screen, which I'll share with you, the verse from Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 28. Lamentations is a book that laments the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in the year 586. May have been written in that context or written with a collective memory of that context, but that's what sets up the book of Lamentations. Jewish tradition ascribes the authorship to Jeremiah, almost certainly not true, but it's based in the understanding that's probably historically accurate, that the prophet Jeremiah was the chief prophet at the time of the destruction of the first temple in the year 586. So it is written from the perspective of one who has witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem and is lamenting that catastrophe. Picking up at verse 24, the Lord is my portion, I say with full heart, therefore will I hope in him. So this is kind of just tropes and themes that are consistent throughout the book of Lamentations. The Lord is good to those who trust in him, to one who seeks him. Tov Adonai lekovav lenefesh tidrishenu. And a lot of this is written in a familiar A statement, B statement. Statement one prime, which is the major form of biblical poetry. Like this verse here, verse 27, Tov la gever ki sa'ol bin urav. It is good for a man when young to bear a yoke. Let him sit alone and be patient when he has it laid upon him. So you say something and then you say it again in a slightly different way. So this is used here as the proof text. It is good for a man when young to bear a yoke. Let him sit alone and be patient when God has laid it upon him, is used as the proof text that even if one is sitting by one's lonesome, God can dwell with that person. I will be the first to tell you, I think it's a stretch, but remember, that's the whole point. Hanina Bentaradion is saying, I wonder if I can come up with a proof text that will demonstrate scripturally what I'm trying to tell you, which is that even if you're studying Torah by yourself, the divine presence will come and visit you. That's where this comes from. Scriptural texts get warped and bent and very creatively reimagined in the way that the rabbis deploy them as proof texts for their own points of view. That's the art of meaning making for the rabbis. So it's very interesting. This is a very meta text because Hanina Bentaradion is using scripture to prove a point. He says, if two people are together and don't study Torah, what a waste. If two people are together and do study Torah, God is with them. And even if one person by his lonesome studies Torah, God is with him. That's the text in summary. But there's so much more happening here, and I appreciate that we could spend 45 minutes or more just on this one segment. Questions, thoughts, comments, and then we'll take one look at the last text for today. Great. Okay, so let us proceed. What we're going to look at is chapter 3, section 3, Mishna 3, because it directly connects. And I think we'll have time. We won't unpack this in nearly the same level of detail, but we'll do 10 minutes and we'll have a nice day, and then we'll have a nice Memorial Day weekend, and then we'll have a nice life. Okay, here we go. So I'm bringing up onto the screen Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, Mishna 3. Rabbi Shimon Omer. So now another rabbi. Sorry, I just want to stop the screen for a minute just so you learn one word about this guy. Rabbi Shimon, interestingly, is the Shimon in question is Shimon Bar Yochai, who is a student of Rabbi Akiva. And the reason that this connects is actually pretty obvious. It is topically connected to the previous Mishnah. So we're going to, just want you to focus on how important small gatherings are to the rabbis who are speaking in this Mishnah and the previous Mishnah. These small gatherings were one of the many ways in which Torah was studied in the ancient world. People would presumably gather around in small circles, maybe around a table, and learn Torah together. I mean, at that point, this should be pretty evident, but I just wanted to reinforce that that's what's happening here. That's who Shimon is. Here we go. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, sorry, I have the wrong text up here. Shimon Bar Yochai, here we go. Pardon me. Share screen. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, if three people have eaten at one table and have not spoken there any words of Torah, it is as if they had eaten sacrifices offered to the dead. You probably don't need a rabbi to tell you that that's a bad thing, right? So your meal has been completely desecrated if you are having lunch and not talking Torah. And here's your proof text, Isaiah. I'm sorry for all of the stomach-turning imagery today. For all tables are full of filthy vomit when the all-present is absent. So we already know from the previous Mishnah that if you sit down at a table and don't study Torah, that God will not be with you. And then Isaiah gives you a further proof text that says, and when you engage in such crass and meaningless conversations so as to devoid your table of God's presence, it is as if you are eating at a table full of filthy vomit, where the Hebrew is equally delicious. It says, Shene'emar ki kol shulchanot, all the tables, if you know shulchan as a table, mala'u ki tso'ah. I mean, tso'ah also means poop. So vomit and poop. Ki tso'ah bli makom. And there's something really fascinating happening here. The Hebrew again, shulchanot maleu ki tsoa bli makom. So you are eating at tables filled with filthy vomit or vomit and diarrhea, bli makom, that literally says without a place. It doesn't say when the all present is absent. That's the way the rabbis are reading it, this text. We'll look at Isaiah 28:8 just to get how the proof text functions and how cleverly the rabbis are warping its original meaning in order for it to fit their new meaning, which is basically, you better study Torah whenever you sit down to a meal. Here's the antilogue, the nice part, and this is the nechemta, the comforting word with which we end our study. We'll have time to unpack this. Aval, however, if three have eaten at one table and have spoken their words of Torah, it is as if they had eaten at the very table of the all-present. That's a word we looked at last time, where makom, which usually means a place, comes to mean the every place, or the God who is omnipresent. The all-present, blessed be God, as it is said, and God said unto me, this is the table before the Lord. And so you have this idea of God comes to hang out at your table, and the precipitating cause is that Torah is spoken at said table. I'll speak just personally. I know my parents like this when I say nice things about them, but I'm not just doing it because they did a lot of things right as parents. But I will tell you that maybe one of the reasons I became a rabbi is because I grew up in a home where words of Torah, though in a reform, very loosely understood way, were in fact spoken around a dinner table. And that, Judaism was always presented as a way of thinking about the world. So I think that I can't give a specific example, but I remember many conversations when I was a kid or an adolescent with my parents and my sister all sitting around the dinner table, because we also had a very Kodesh understanding, a sacred understanding of the function of family dinner time. It was really a fixed part of our upbringing. That, conversation didn't just have to be around, well, what did you get on the test today? It was more like, oh, what kind of conversation? I was a very eager student. I'm sure you're not surprised, as was my sister. And we would come home and talk about, yeah, exactly. My dad is reminding me, he sent me a little chat of one conversation in particular where something mundane could become an occasion to talk Torah. I told this story a few years ago on Rosh Hashanah. I think it was Rosh Hashanah, about, the time I was at the Jersey Shore and went to a tchotchke shop and wanted to buy, I had some allowance money and I wanted to buy what Brian Katz had bought. He was my best friend growing up. Fun story. Brian Katz's older sister is Rabbi Lori Katz-Braun, who served WRT as one of our rabbis for a few years back in the late 90s. Fun fact, early 2000s, just before I came to WRT. Brian Katz was my childhood best friend. He bought a lucky rabbit's foot and I wanted one too. And my dad said, well, you can buy that if you want, but I don't think it's very Jewish. And so that's a way in which Torah values became part of the day-to-day. By the way, I don't think he ever explained his meaning until I asked, but I didn't buy the rabbit's foot. I later asked him, I said, well, what's this about? And he explained, well, they kill the animal just to sell its foot as a souvenir. And that, speaking of, putrid drops and vomit on your table, that'll make you lose your appetite for soft serve, but okay. Anyway, what does it mean to have a table where Torah is spoken? I think that the rabbis want to elevate the idea of ordinary discourse can be made holy simply by the infusion of Jewish values. And not only that, that's where you find God. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. And I think that that's worth contemplating before we depart. So I'd like to open this up for any other comments that people would like to share, either in the chat window or by unmuting yourself or raising a digital hand, please. I can't see all the hands on the screen.
Okay, well, I guess so. Okay.
Yeah, Ivan, I see your hand. You can speak.
Okay, well, you said that in a sense, the mystery of creation, the mystery of existence, the mystery of one's body, the mystery of relationship is kind of uniform everywhere. And the explanation is the one that finds God in many different ways. And that, just adds to an understanding that, and you mentioned that in a functioning society, though we talked about government, but individuals, thousands of years ago for the Hindus and maybe 3,000 or more years ago for the Jews, and I don't quite know whether the Christians picked up on that with Jesus or the first synod, that established the catechism of the Christian church. All I know is it is extremely difficult for me and for many others to just on your own, without the relationship to other human beings, to contemplate what is the world, who am I, what's my role, and what has happened when I look upstairs, at the stars and the wonder of it. There is a connection from there to me. And you expressed it very nicely.
Thank you. I think that, look, Judaism doesn't, or the rabbis do not want to preclude the role of individual contemplation. But at the end of the day, our religious tradition is founded or makes much of the spiritual possibilities that emerge out of relationship. And I think that that's what gets highlighted in the texts we've looked at today. And that's why it's, again, I hope you won't view it as just a kind of a glib turn of phrase or an idle compliment when I say how gratifying I find it to study with you, and not to do this on my own. My understanding of these texts is immensely enriched by teaching them, but by learning them with you. And it's not just what you share in class, it's that you are the prompt to actually go back and visit these texts. And often the insights that I share with you are coming to me as we are studying them, the same way they are for you. So I want to say thank you. I just want to clarify the use of the proof text here. So I have on the screen the Isaiah. It's pretty clever what they're doing. The context is, as often happens in prophetic literature, the prophet is taking to task the religious officials for being bad. But these are also muddled by wine and dazed by liquor. Priest and prophet are muddled by liquor. They are confused by wine. They are dazed by liquor. They are muddled in their visions. They stumble in judgment. So Isaiah has a lot of, what's that line from the late, great Jerry Stiller and Festivus and Seinfeld? The airing of grievances. I got a lot of problems with you people. So this is Isaiah in the role of the airing of grievances against priests and prophets, saying, you guys are drunkards. You don't even know what you're talking about. How can you present a clear vision of God if you're intoxicated? Your judgment is clouded. But then he says something that becomes a proof text for the rabbis of something completely other, which is often what happens. Like I said, the text is ripped out of its original context, warped in its meaning by being deployed in a new context. Ki kol shulchanot mala'u kitzoa bli makom. Yea, all the tables are covered with vomit and filth, so that no space is left. That's the literal meaning of bli makom, right? All of the tables of the priests and the prophets are covered with their vomit and filth. Like literally, they've drunk themselves into a stupor where they are barfing up, right? And pooping out uncontrollably. So their table, or maybe just their words, are simile, metaphors for vomit and filth. And there's no room left. You can't even get a clear word out of these awful religious officials because they are so clouded in their judgment. It's quite an indictment. Bli makom, so that no space is left, in the rabbinic teaching becomes bli makom, without the presence of the omnipresent one. Bli, without, makom, one of the many epithets that is ascribed to God. So when you were at a table filled with dross, which in this case is not a product of drunkenness, but rather conversation devoid of Torah, or even more, conversation devoid of spiritual value, then there's no room at that table for God to be present. In contrast, my good friends, what an incredible table we have created here over these many months of study. I promise we will resume. I'd like to keep studying Pirkei Avot. We have some other ideas about creating tables both in person and virtually, starting around the holiday time or right after the high holidays, with the high holidays falling on Labor Day. Your clergy and the staff of WRT have an incredible amount of heavy lifting to do over the next 3 months. So even though I'll be offline from weekly teaching, please be assured that we will be working hard to create a very meaningful experience of the high holidays. The plan right now is to enable as many people who wish to gather in person to be able to do so in the absolute safest way possible. That will probably lead us to have multiple spaces where we will be praying, some of them at the campus of WRT, some of those indoors, some of those conceivably outdoors. And we have a very strong possibility that at least one of our major praying locations this year will be offsite. I don't want to say too much because we're in an exploratory conversation with a place nearby that's in Scarsdale, but that has a lot of potentially covered tent outdoor space and a lot of parking availability. And one of our challenges is that if we want to build a huge tent in the back part of the parking lot, we've eliminated a lot of parking spaces. So we're also starting from the premise that because the holidays start on Labor Day at night, Monday night is Rosh Hashanah, we're hoping for better and warmer weather. We're anticipating that at least a significant percentage of the community will want to daven outdoors or would feel more comfortable being outside. We're not sure that yet. We will almost certainly use indoor spaces as well for those who, especially for those who are vaccinated and who feel comfortable praying inside. So it's going to be a different kind of high holidays. There will be lots of in-person worship. There will also be a robust, well-produced video stream of what's happening live that you can receive in your homes. So anyone who wants to or who needs to tune in from home at various times will also have that ability. So we've got but now to get from vision to execution, I need the next 3 months. I do want to share with you that the other work of WRT goes on uninterrupted, and there's a lot of joyful stuff happening. So this Friday, the cutoff was already Tuesday. We always have a sign up in-person cutoff on Tuesday for the, on Tuesday for the Friday of that week. But we will be presenting the annual Brotherhood Award to our congregant and past president, Lisa Messenger. That's going to be a lovely service. I actually hear that Rabbi Jacobs and Cantor Abramson are both going to be with us on Friday night, just in the congregation. So I'm really happy to see them. And then the following Friday, I begin a year of preaching on the prophets, on one of the great Jewish prophets, Bob Dylan. And in fact, my opening remarks, though I've not written a word yet, will make the case for Bob Dylan as prophet. And every week I've challenged, every time I preach, and by the way, the high holidays, they're all Bob Dylan sermons. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I've made this commitment. I'm going to stick to it because on Monday, May 24th, Bob Dylan celebrates his 80th birthday. And well, that just doesn't happen every day. So I really would like to invite you to join me in a celebration of Bob Dylan's music and message. There will be Bob Dylan music throughout the year. There may even be a Bob Dylan themed clergy concert later on this summer. So stay tuned for all this good stuff. But the text from the Torah is, of course, the weekly portion. And there will always be a text from the music of Bob Dylan. So next Friday night, I am starting off the only way that will be possible to start a year of Bob Dylan preaching, which is with the song Like a Rolling Stone. So stay tuned for next Friday. I'm very excited about this. Now all I have to do is actually write the damn sermon. That's So I got my work cut out for me. Then we have many special Shabbatot coming up in June. So I'll just highlight them for you. Friday night, June 4th, please join us for a celebration of Pride Shabbat, where we will explore and celebrate the way in which the Jewish and LGBTQ communities are standing in solidarity. June is Pride Month, as many of us know. And our speaker will be a young man who is I believe, a senior at Skidmore College who grew up at WRT. His name is Griffin Frankel, and he's going to talk about his own journey and his Judaism. And it's going to be a very powerful Shabbat. That's the June 4th. June 11th is our high school send-off Shabbat, where we will honor our graduating seniors and present the Tracy Kreisberg Award to an outstanding member of the 10th grade confirmation class. The recipient this year is Isabel Goldban. And we send Mazel Tov to Isabel. And then we will also present the first ever Bauman Scholars Award in memory of Sam Bauman of blessed memory to our outstanding senior, Josh Marks. And then finally, on the 18th, we will celebrate Juneteenth in a service of celebration and solidarity with our friends from Greater Centennial AME Zion Church in Mount Vernon, and their pastor, Reverend Stephen W. Pogue, will be our speaker that night. All of these services are anticipated to take place outside in good weather, in the sanctuary in poor weather, with a stream as well, so that you can enjoy them from home. So there's a lot coming up between now and June 18th, and I look forward to celebrating all of these special moments with you. Finally, next Tuesday night is the Congregational annual meeting. We ask that you would tune in online. It's a very important moment in the life of the congregation, because we need our congregation to show up to approve the budget for the coming year, to approve the nominating committee's slate of trustees and officers. And this year, we are also welcoming officially to the role of WRT president, our congregant and president-elect, Warren Haber. So please join us Tuesday evening online for the Congregational annual meeting as we celebrate Warren being elected president of WRT. And we thank Marcy Harris for her 4 years of service in that role. That's all I got. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful afternoon. I'll wish you an early Shabbat Shalom, and I can't wait to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.